Hi, I'm Tom Woods, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I am your host, Doug Stewart, but for today's episode, I and Dr. Norman Horn are going to be the guest on the Counterflow Podcast, which we did a few weeks ago with Buck Johnson. We had a great conversation about a lot of important questions, partly about faith-seeking freedom, but this was from somebody who had just recently read our book, had some fun things to ask us, some challenging things, and we just really thought you would enjoy the content of the episode. So enjoy.
With me today, Norman Horn and Doug Stewart. Welcome both of you guys to the show.
Hey, thanks, man. It's good to be here with you.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
So we're going to talk about this book. Oddly enough, I'm listening to the book, the audio book version, and I recognize the voices, and it's like I have two friends talking in my ears. It's my producer Chris Williams reading it, along with the ad sales guy for the Renegade Media Network, my friend Bobby Pearson. So it's neat to hear them doing it.
Oh, it's not the devil on your right and the angel on the left? Oh, okay. So
if you only knew, it might actually be that. So you guys have never been on my show before, and when that happens, I like to have the guests, in this case guests, give a quick intro on who they are, what they do. And I'll ask about the LCI, the Libertarian Christian Institute, as well. But Norman, why don't you start off with a little intro about yourself?
Oh, sure. Well, so my background is really as a scientist and engineer and a lifelong Christian as well. So I grew up in Austin, Texas, and that's where I kind of became a libertarian, even as a young grad student about 16 years ago, and got started in it just by reading, articles from the Mises Institute by pretty much, who you'd expect, Murray Rothbard, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and others, of course. And just fell in love with the ideas of Austrian economics, which led me into just deeper and deeper study of libertarianism. Over time, that really evolved into a greater understanding theologically of what was going on, regarding the intersections of liberty and Christian ideas and Christian theology. And so that kind of evolved into starting something called libertarianchristians.com, which got a nice bit of attention at first from some of our good friends, people like Tom Woods, Lou Rockwell, and others. And that got a little bit of instant publicity there as a result. And it just kind of kept steamrolling, got Doug involved a couple of years later. And then we turned that into the Libertarian Christian Institute in I guess we incorporated it as a 501c3 nonprofit in 2015. And so that was really exciting, of course. And then we've just been growing ever since and just doing the best we can to talk about these intersections of faith and freedom and doing the best we can of just promoting the ideas of a free society to the modern church today.
When were you last in Austin? Even visiting?
Well, okay. Actually, it would have been in July.
Okay.
I came down. I was there just for a couple of days. I don't really want to give all the details as to why, but I was there. I was also there in the height of lockdown COVID land, actually in May 2020 as well.
Mm-hmm.
But that was specifically for testing and stuff with my main job.
Have you noticed how much flack you would get now in Austin for being a libertarian versus back in, like you said, 16 years ago? Have you noticed a difference in the political climate in that sense?
It's kind of hard to say. The biggest thing that I noticed in terms of just changes in Austin beyond just the skyline itself was the tent camps,
yes,
quite frankly, which is really, really sad.
Yeah.
Just going, driving in and going up 290 to going toward 360 and whatnot. Oh my gosh, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And every single overpass had a tent camp underneath. And it's just like, what is this? Looks like San Francisco. What is going on here? That's really sad because it didn't used to be like that.
Right.
And so that's disturbing in a number of respects. And, that was the biggest change. Like back in the day, it was funny. in the church, and 15 or 16 years ago, I literally got the response at one point, like, so you're a libertarian. Does that mean you vote for the Green Party? That was reality 15 or 20 years ago for us in the Libertarian movement at times.
Yes.
And I mean, like, obviously it's a little distance from that, but you kind of want to go Luke Skywalker on him from Last Jedi and say, every word in that sentence was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And there has been a substantial change since then. I don't know as much about what's happening in Austin there, other than from my great friend Jason Rink, who's on our board and is involved in the libertarian community, broadly speaking. And but like I don't know exactly what's going on so much anymore in the city itself. I have tried to stay much more abreast of what's really happening in the church at large, and that's been interesting, of course.
Well, Doug, we can't forget you in this introduction phase. Talk about who you are, what you do, and what led you to all of this.
Yeah, so right now I am a part-time CEO at the Libertarian Christian Institute. My day job, like Norman, we also have day jobs. As I run a small video production company in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, as well as a web design company, and I do a few other things as well. And so let's see, my story getting into libertarianism. I mean, I grew up a Christian in a conservative Christian family, sort of the red country mindset, conservative mindset in the church. And when I was just a little bit out of college, going into seminary, I became a libertarian. Here's the provocative way to put it. I became a libertarian because I was interested in social justice. And what happened was I realized that the left just had all the wrong answers. And I was like, you know what? If there's going to be any sense of social answers to like what is socially unjust, I need to study some economics, because I had no interest in economics in high school or in college and take any of it. And I stumbled into the Austrian School of Economics, started with a Bob Murphy book, ended up landing on Ron Paul because I used to listen to Glenn Beck, and Ron Paul was always on about the financial economy stuff for Glenn Beck. That was the one thing that Glenn Beck had him on for. So that's what sort of led me into it. And then, of course, Norman beat me to libertarianchristians.com domain name by about 3 months. So
wow,
it might have been a different story had I registered for that domain before him. But anyway, he was just a little bit ahead of the curve. But anyway, no, we joined forces a few years after that, which is around 2010. And so I was part of the community there. And then when we incorporated in 2015, I was on the board and, eventually now the CEO, keeping the content train going.
Let me ask this. I was going to ask this towards the end, but it just popped and I have to now because I'm so curious. With what you guys do at the Libertarian Christian Institute, do you find it harder to convince your average libertarian on the importance of Christianity, or harder to convince the average Christian on the virtues of libertarianism? Norman, I'll let you take that.
I would say that the latter, that educating the Christian is harder, because just there's so much entrenched ideas amongst both the Christian right and the Christian left as to how especially in American Christendom, I should say, and how we are to understand the political arena. Whereas the libertarian we're already like kind of talking the same language with regards to the problems of power and economics and so on. And really it is, if they have a misconception about Christians in the first place, it's something like, well, aren't Christians just all like this? And you say, no, in fact, that's not the case. And in fact, it's actually something entirely different. And here's what the reality needs to be. And like, we're accepting of you in terms of, if we can interact peaceably together, then we're good, right? And they're like, oh yeah, I guess that's right. Okay, we're cool. And that often, more often than not, I should say, happens. There is a bit of a militant side to some, but I'd say that their voices are just particularly loud and not particularly numerous.
Do you think that there's an atheist problem within libertarian movement at large?
Not exactly. I wouldn't I don't want to put it as to say yes and then, the atheist problem is X or something like that. I would say that we're, fundamentally we are against things like, materialism and against secularism per se, but that's as Christians.
Right.
And even as Christians, even if we're against certain things, that doesn't mean that we want to, clearly we can, and we are committed to not initiating force against others, because it's not part of our belief system to be forcing others into our way of being. And so I don't think that there's, a particular atheist problem in the sense of, that there is something that is necessarily needing to be opposed, driven out of the movement or something. Does that make sense? I think that's kind of where I want to go with it. I don't want to live in a world where, Stephan Kinsella, who's a good friend of mine and who's a staunch atheist,
yes,
and I can't get along. Like that's crazy. I wouldn't want that. And he neither does he. So, if I can be, in fellowship per se with this guy, Norman Stephan Kinsella, and talk about IP and talk about this, that, and the other, whatnot. He's a great friend of mine. That's not, I would be totally against people trying to go off on him or something like that because he's being an atheist or something like that.
Sure.
I'm not interested in that,
Doug, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. You call it, I know you're just posing a question, but an atheist problem. I'm just like, well, no, not really. I mean, the only thing that I would say, other than echoing Norman, is I would add, it's like, well, maybe if there's libertarians who say that you can't be a libertarian if you believe in a God or if you believe in the Christian God. And, of course, we would say, well, no, just read your Bible and just take a look at our book. We can explain to you why. We can explain to you why being a libertarian is fundamental to being a good Christian. And, their experience then of Christianity is probably a little bit off. So, no, I don't think there is a problem there.
So this is another thing I want to get to because the word libertarian has been so abused and bastardized, you might say. For the people listening that either refuse to call themselves that anymore, or I've got a wide variety of listeners here that are still maybe unclear on what exactly that means. Let's get with you first, Doug. What does libertarianism mean to you?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of thoughts that come to mind. I mean, part of it is libertarian as an orientation toward individual liberty so that, the greatest number of people in the greatest possible way can have individual freedom and freedom of choice within the non-aggression principle. And so that's sort of like a foundational aspect to it. So if you are in favor of giving more people more individual liberty, I would say you can call yourself a libertarian, you can call yourself a conservative, you can call yourself whatever you want, but you're kind of in my favor, if you will. Now, there's the philosophical, hey, here's what defines what a libertarian is. And there's the thick and thin argument. There's
yes.
How big are your parameters? Who do you include? I know the old joke about if you put 11 libertarians in the room, there's only, there's only one thing they all agree on is that there's only one libertarian in the room, and it's all them, right? So, I mean, that's almost an old joke. So, to me, it's more about a way of thinking and a way of treating others. It's one of those ways that we can love our neighbor as ourselves. And so, for me, it's like, well, why would I care what you're doing other than when you're aggressing upon someone else? Right. And so that's kind of the way, what libertarianism means to me, if we're going to ask it that way.
Norman, would you add anything to that?
The focus on the non-aggression principle is absolutely certain in our definition of what a libertarian is. And I think that's really what it comes down to. And that if people are wanting to reject the name libertarian for some strange strategic reason, it's like, oh, okay, fine, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the definition. So the definition being that we are against aggression, great. And that means maximum liberty as a result, great. And as Christians, and why we call ourselves the Libertarian Christian Institute, is because we also believe that is convergent with or congruent with or concordant with the bulk of Christian theology. And that's crucial to who we are in particular. The golden rule is applicable here to us, is that if we were to do unto others as we would want to be treated, and the other side of that coin is don't do to others what you don't want done to you. And so that's, to me, that's the only way to kind of expand upon what Doug says, is that, we definitionally, it's about aggression. We oppose it. That's the reality. So
you kind of alluded to it there. Basically, what this book is about that we're going to be talking about is that you want Christians and libertarians to kind of see this, looking at each other, this is the philosophy for me, this is the religion for me. Let me also, how would you classify your religion, Norman? Is there
denomination-wise?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been a lifelong member of the Churches of Christ in the what we call the Stone Campbell Restorationist movement. We talked about that. We talk about that frequently on the podcast and in various articles and whatnot. So there's a really interesting, actually, like kind of liberty history even within the Churches of Christ.
Doug?
Well, I'm going to borrow Mike Meharry's phraseology for himself, and he says he's a theological mutt because he grew up in all these different things. I grew up like a conservative Baptist, and I go to an evangelical free church, which is not very helpful in the name because you want to, is it free of evangelicals or is it a free evangelicals, but it was basically an anti-state church orientation. Yeah, they came out of the bargain.
They were with your whiskey. They were with your whiskey.
If people
Norman.
want to get a sort of frame of mind about where I am, probably somewhere like Anabaptist / Anglican, but that's just theologically, I guess, more so than anything.
All right.
You always get a different answer like every other week with Doug. So, it's like this one.
So let's give an elevator pitch as to why libertarianism is the best political philosophy for those who consider themselves Christians. Norman?
All right. It's very simply that it is the most consistent way in which a Christian can express political ideas. If you claim to be a Christian and one who is to love his enemies, practice the golden rule, pray for those who persecute them, and all that, then there's really only one political philosophy that makes sense for you, and that is the libertarian way of thinking. Now, that is kind of the culmination of a whole lot of different stuff that's occurred over Christian history in many respects. It's not like libertarianism, existed in the first century or something like that. But even then, in the first century, following the death, the burial, resurrection of Christ and the early church, they were practicing ideas of nonviolence, of trying to treat other people with dignity and respect. And that has leavened the course of human history ever since. And I think that politically, the way that we kind of think about this is that as we are trying to solve conflicts with one another over scarce resources in general, that the best way we can kind of understand how to do this is the application of property rights and the application of homesteading principle and the application of these libertarian ideas. That kind of culminates in the philosophy that we call libertarianism. And so there's really no other way to me that makes ultimate sense in kind of how to express a political philosophy consistently without using libertarian ideas if you're to claim and practice Christian theology consistently as well.
Would the libertarian part be strictly then for discussions on involving politics? Because if they are so similar and you define yourself as a Christian, really that's all you would need. And it might manifest itself through certain policies that you like or dislike when you get to politics. But it almost would seem that the libertarian part, maybe other than a strict discussion of politics, it would be irrelevant.
So it's kind of like, if you think about it like a Venn diagram of such, there are plenty of things in Christianity that have nothing to do with politics. And in fact, we should be thankful for the fact that most of our lives is not having to do with politics. Thank the Lord for that. But in the limited set of things that have to do with political discussions and whatnot, and we have to figure out ways of dealing with these elements of difficult life together, where we don't have close relations, and so we need to figure out ways of resolving conflicts that don't result in utter bloodshed all the time. And that's where libertarian ideas make the best sense. And to see how that intersects with Christian theology in various ways is very useful. It helps us to understand why, for instance, then that ultimately like divine right of kings ideas are, garbage and so on and so forth, and why communism is a bad idea, and communism just somehow practiced in the context of Christian thought or whatever is like, no, that doesn't work either, and here's why, as the Puritans kind of figured out when they immigrated to America years and years ago. And so I think that it's just those kind of congruent lines are helpful, but in as much as they relate to kind of ethical considerations, that's where we see that congruence really come together. But the basic ideas as well, as they flow out of kind of natural law, if you will, are things that are of akin to like mathematics or logic, as opposed to some type of deeply revealed secret knowledge or something like that. There's nothing secret about it per se. We're not some sort of neo-Gnosticism freakish cult here or whatever that's trying to reinvent Christian theology. That would be, I think, how I'd best answer where you're coming from with that question there.
Okay. Doug, any thoughts on that?
Well, one of the names for Jesus in the Bible is Prince of Peace. And one of the major threads throughout the scripture is anti-state or anti-empire. And it is a very important thread. And this is where that whole social justice thing came in for me. I'm like, wait a second. The Bible is very much against this idea of empire that controls and dominates and is centralized and basically oppresses. And Jesus came to liberate. And the whole thread and theme of all of these things throughout the scripture is that we are to be against that which dominates. And the state is, of course, not only explicitly the thing to be against in the scriptures, it also is still present with us now that we are to be against. So in terms of living out, you said something about, isn't the Christian aspect of it like enough to sort of talk about this? In some ways, I kind of agree. It's like, well, if you are a Christian, you are living in contradiction to the state because you are telling the state, Jesus is Lord and Caesar, you, the state, are not. Those who can see us on YouTube can see that I'm wearing a hat that says Jesus is Lord and Caesar is crossed out, which is something that we kind of lose when we say that as Christians today, that Jesus is Lord. It's kind of this private religious experience that we're kind of referring to. But in the first century, this was essentially a let's go Brandon to the Caesar kind of moment.
Yes. Very well done. Yeah.
I had to work that in somehow.
That's an original Doug.
Yes. It's got a touch, just enough boomerism to that I like it. It's perfect.
Oh, man.
Minor boomerism.
Just a little bit. Let's talk about some of the questions that you guys tackle in the book. There's a lot of them. And like I said, if my listeners out there get the audio book version of this, you'll hear my good friend Bobby reading the question. And then, of course, my producer Chris answering the questions. And I'm glad you guys tackled this early on in the book because I'm so tired of seeing the lefties I know pull this old line out. And you probably know where I'm going with this, is that Jesus was a socialist. I know you guys have seen it a lot. You talk about it. You write about it in this book. Let's tackle this one right off the bat. Doug, whoever really wants to take this one.
Doug,
I'll let you go for it. Oh, we're gonna fight over who goes for it. Was Jesus a socialist? I think this is the funny thing about this question to me is that I see these like left-leaning Christians put up memes about what Jesus did, like he gave them free healthcare and by healing them and all of this, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Like this is ridiculous. Like this is the kind of mindset that we've sunk to when we do Christian theology. It's like, well, because Jesus wanted us to treat each other with dignity and take care of each other, and he told stories about an individual using his own resources to help a guy on the other side of the road, the Good Samaritan, that Jesus was a if socialist means Jesus wants us all to help our neighbor out of our own free will, then sure, but that's not at all what socialism is.
Yeah.
And so the Bible is just chock full of Jesus calling people who want to follow him. And I would say this, there is a call to everybody, I think, that Jesus makes to follow him. Okay. And so it is the individual's choice to actually say, you know what? I think what you've got to say, Lord, is worth following, and I'm going to trust you and put my allegiance in you, not Caesar, and then I'm going to walk a certain way. And that way does include helping those in need. Somehow there's that big gap between that and the government has to do it, and that's the leap that leftists tend to make. It's like, well, okay, well, if Jesus wants people to do it, and I think in their mind, it's more like, well, if the government does it, I think Barack Obama said the government's just a shorthand way of saying things we do together or something like that. If that's their mindset,
that's called
then of course they're going to think that they're, well, yeah, I know. If that's their mindset, then I can see why they make that connection. But, as Murray Rothbard points out in The Anatomy of the State, like the state is not that. And if I could say anything to leftist Christians, their theologians do a really good job of pointing out empire in Scripture, but they are completely blinded to the fact that the goals that they have for society completely depend on the empire, on Leviathan, that they all theologically eschew already.
Yeah, it's completely insane. I really don't understand how it's necessary to write. Like, I love Larry Reed's little book, Was Jesus a Socialist? It's spot on. It's great stuff. But I kind of don't understand why it needs to be written on some level, because it's just so crazy when you think about it. Because at no point, now, again, this kind of comes down to what's the definition of socialism. All right. Let us recall the definition of socialism. It is the means of production being owned by the state apparatus. At any point in Jesus's theological musings in any point of his teachings, at any point, did he point to Rome and say, you know what, everybody's capital, everybody's resources needs to be controlled by Rome. It's the only way this is going to work, guys. Come on. It's like, are you kidding me? So if somehow, it's like Doug's saying, if somehow we're supposed to interpret, Jesus as saying, you should help other people as, you know what, point guns at other people and force them to go help these other folks over on this other point. And it's like, come on. Come on, man. Yeah. As is one of our more recent dictators' famous phrases at this point. Yeah.
Hi, this is Carrie Baldwin. And if you like the Libertarian Christian Podcast, you'll like our other podcast, Good News, Bad News, a roundtable where you can join me, Matt, Norman, Doug, Aaron, and others analyze the news from a libertarian Christian perspective. Check us out on YouTube, your favorite podcast app, or on libertarianchristians.com/roundtable.
There's this one topic that's rarely ever heated within libertarian circles or any circles. It's just abortion, right? Yeah. So that is funny. That's obviously a topic that politically people argue about constantly. I have so many thoughts on this. I joked with someone the other day that the left now loves corporations and they believe that they should be able to dictate to their employees their medical decisions regarding the vaccine. And boy, could you imagine if they were only dictating that a woman that was employed there couldn't get an abortion?
Oh, yeah.
See the tide turn once again. But that's a whole nother
COVID
rant.
has turned our world upside down, Buck. Haven't you heard? All the conservatives are pro-choice and all the leftists are pro-life.
Yeah, it's wild. But even
just in a completely different way.
Throughout the years in libertarianism, abortion has been kind of a hot topic. Rothbard had a certain view on it, and so many famous figures from our movement can disagree on this topic. I want to ask you about it. Just as another aside, when I was trying to convince normies to vote for Ron Paul in 2008 and 2012, they'd look at, I like this.
It sounds funny when people say that, to me. It's like
normies.
Yeah.
It's like,
oh, gotcha.
That's usually what the cute chicks call me,
Yeah,
no, just
very
kidding.
well done.
Just kidding.
All right, normie.
Okay, boomer.
Yeah.
They would go down his list of his platform, and they go, he's so great. Oh my God, he's pro-life though. I always thought that's the thing that's that tears you apart.
That's your issue?
Yeah, okay. He's anti-war. The Federal Reserve is messing everything up. But oh wow, okay.
That was an asset for all of our friends, Buck.
Yeah.
For me, convincing our conservative friends, that was an asset. You know what wasn't? Sorry, this isn't about Ron Paul right now, but what wasn't an asset was, wait, he wants to bring the troops home?
Isn't that crazy?
Oh yeah, it did make for a wonderful few years. The Ron Paul years were fantastic, but that's for perhaps another story. So
yes, yeah. Let's talk about abortion. How can the Christian view of abortion sync up with libertarianism?
I think the first off, one thing that we need to note is that despite the fact that there have been pro-abortion advocates in libertarianism's history, there have equally been just as many pro-life people. And it just goes to show, again, like we kind of talked about earlier, that there's a lot of arguing that goes on in libertarianism. And so it is not intuitively obvious right off the bat that the non-aggression principle should exclude abortion, okay? But when we start parsing it out and we start working through the philosophy, and to libertarians' credit, the fact that we're willing to argue about this in a respectful manner to each other, and sometimes maybe not necessarily respectful, but at least we're adamant about exploring the principles correctly and trying to understand the implications therein and really, really caring about that, then I would say that for those of you who are on the pro-life stance already, then libertarianism should be about as good as you could possibly get for a philosophy that has the potential to really put on solid ground the pro-life stance, okay? Because once we get there and people accept that, then it's going to be, it becomes almost a plank at that point. So yes, there's work to be done there. And what is that work? Well, it is trying to understand better how the non-aggression principle works its way in here. So, first of all, I think that I want to point out here that everything I'm about to say is probably going to be better said by our one of our co-authors in the book, Carrie Baldwin,
Yes.
who did write the particular chapter here is chapter 11, What About Abortion? Carrie Baldwin has done tremendous work in writing up the best arguments that I've seen with respect to abortion. She's also debated the eminent Walter Block, who we have great respect for, even though we disagree with him on the topic of evictionism and whatnot.
Yes.
And foundational to Carrie's argument is this. Non-aggression is about respecting the rights of individuals. And, fundamentally, a fetus that has been conceived is in a sense an invited guest and has and contains within itself individual rights. Now, if we care about supporting individual rights and also the individual rights of the mother at the same time, promoting abortion is actually not a life-affirming option either for the fetus or for the mother. And that in order to we have better options for getting rid of abortion than just trying to say, well, let's just strike it down in Supreme Court. Let's just strike it down in law or something like that. But there are more life-affirming options out there that will both reduce abortions in the first place, which is kind of the goal here. Even for those who are pro-abortion, I think on some level you don't want to see it happen.
Right.
But more importantly, affirming the rights of both individuals at that point. And that's laid out more comprehensively in the book for sure. But I hope that that's at least kind of a taste of what's in store.
Yeah. And let's get to, there's a section towards the end, and I know I'm skipping some, but we'll kind of jump around. It's one of my favorite ones, Christian misconceptions of libertarianism. And because it's just, we've all dealt with just misconceptions of libertarianism throughout the years. It happens all the time. Like you mentioned earlier, so you vote for someone in the Green Party. Okay.
Yeah. To be fair, and what's fun, I wrote most of that section too. So
all right. You hit on one that's always out there, and I hear libertarians say this too, and it drives me crazy. So libertarianism, that just means you don't like authority, right? No authority. That's what you guys are for. Can you talk about that, please?
I think proper views of authority don't have to be domination structures. What we are against is not the idea of authority itself, but the idea of aggression being part of an authority structure. My parents or my elders at my church or even my boss, they do have some measure of positional authority that I have voluntarily agreed to. But more than that, real authority, real power in the kind of the Christian sense of power is actually like personal based. In that, because I know that these people, and I'm serious even when I talk about like my boss, even at work, when I know that these people who do have a form of positional authority also have my best interest at heart, and I'm voluntarily in relationship with them in order to make all of us better, then authority is no problem anymore. Because we're all working together toward kind of common goals, if you will. And that when we do disagree, we can have, kind of an adult conversation about it, to where it's not merely just acquiescence at all costs, but rather that we want to make sure that trust structure is well in place in order to do good things together. That all of that together means that we don't have to be afraid of the idea of authority. Authority comes in a bunch of different shapes and sizes, if you will. It doesn't have to be coinciding with aggression all the time. And so I would say that the kind of the left libertarians perspective at times, which has been very just anti-authority in general, and it's one thing to be anti-authoritarian, it's another to be anti-authority, period, is a bit fallacious, and that we have opportunities based on the division of labor, based on a recognition of experience, based on the trust that we have between individuals that allow for varying forms of authority to take place without aggressing against individual rights.
And I think there's probably an unfortunate reality that a lot of the voices within the liberty world that seem to be more prevalent to, again, a normie, if you will, they do promote certain lifestyles and libertinism to a certain extent, because I've heard Christians tell me, oh, so libertarianism's kind of like maybe a little bit conservative, but just having a lifestyle that you're good with anything out there kind of thing. And libertine is thrown around a lot. Do you guys see that that's kind of an unfortunate problem in our circles?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people can get that impression, is that like, well, people just want to go smoke weed or just like do whatever they want, and like there's no sort of like care in the world. And I guess that's sort of an unwanted side effect to some extent. But the way that I try to bring that conversation back is like, look, we're the kind of people who says that everybody should treat each other with equal respect, regardless of your choices, and that's how other people should treat us. Like it's kind of a like don't tread on anyone sort of attitude. So it really is about like, maybe I don't want you, Buck, to smoke pot this weekend, but I'm not going to call the cops on you, right? Like even if I don't want, unless somehow that's aggressing on me because whatever, if I'm your neighbor, and I mean there could be all those kinds of issues, I suppose, but there's no like moral authority that I have to say I need cops to come beat down your door because you're doing something I don't like. Right. That's not harmful.
I think part of it too, over the years, there's been this kind of pop culture tendency, even within libertarianism, to want to appeal to the left a little bit because that's who runs everything that's popular, that's pop culture. So if you lead with, well, we want to legalize drugs, and you lead with that kind of thing, maybe sometimes people feel like, well, I'll be kind of in the cool kid gang if I kind of lead with these things. And we're, anti-war is good, but it's anti-war and we're for legalizing all drugs, and then you like sneak away and we also don't like Obamacare. Shh. So let's see. There's a statement in this book, and I love it. And I think really libertarians need to hear this more often. Libertarianism does not purport to be the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Can you please go into that a little bit? That's really, really important. And I think, again, libertarians themselves need to understand that as well.
Yeah. It's as simple as this. It is not a comprehensive worldview. Libertarianism does not have the answer to life, the universe, and everything. It addresses a very specific set of topics on how we can interact with each other in better and more positive ways. But it doesn't even answer all the types of questions that could come into that. We need to be careful and not try to overextend that which we do find very compelling and important, the libertarian philosophy, into areas where it doesn't need to be.
Yes.
And I think Christians should be able to understand this. That even like amongst us thinking Christians out there, my father-in-law, my father-in-law and I are from different denominational backgrounds, but I love this particular phrase that he taught me years and years ago, where he likes to say, the Bible doesn't teach you to make a cake. All right. I mean, the Bible is wonderful for explaining a whole lot of different stuff about human existence, but it doesn't teach you how to bake a cake. And likewise, libertarianism explains a lot of important aspects about the way in which we should be interacting with each other in a political basis. But it doesn't teach you how to, solve all the problems of the world. It doesn't tell you, like, okay, it might tell you, for instance, that, the state's not going to be able to solve poverty. Mm-hmm. But it's not going to just tell you, well, here are the steps it's going to take in order to get there, in reality. We know that it's going to be capitalism and production is going to do it, but doesn't tell you how Norman Horn should go into his business and manage all of his salespeople in order to alleviate poverty or something. Mm-hmm. It doesn't do that, and that's not the way it works. So I think Christians and libertarians should be able to understand this to each other, and the fact that they don't always play nice in this way is kind of baffling to me. I mean, because and I think it's actually some equivocation and smoke screens being thrown up by Christians who are against libertarianism in this regard, because they want to, kind of abscond away at times with the ability to muse politically about things, because they want to, often those, especially on the Christian right, want to, give some intellectual cover for their political compatriots there. And so they try to use religion as kind of a bludgeon in that respect. And we're not going to do that. We don't want to use anything as a bludgeon to make people do what we want them to do. We only use persuasion. And that should be the way of the Christian. That should be the way of the libertarian. I don't see how that doesn't work together anymore. So I think that's a great thing to kind of tease out here, to realize that these sorts of things are where we really need to put our focus.
Does a free society have limits?
Does a free society have limits? Yeah, I mean, that's... Sometimes we're chuckling because some of these questions we're like, do we have to ask this? Because, there is a question there, who will build the roads, and, all the ones that we all libertarians say like, oh, okay, yeah. Does a free society have limits? Well, yeah, it's a free society. That means everybody's free, not just you. And so your freedom ends where you're harming me. I mean, we know the libertarian, answer, but of course we have to spell that out for other Christians. And by the way, one of the reasons we wrote this book and sort of the primary driver was for Christian libertarians to have succinct answers to these kinds of questions that we're sort of chuckling and wondering why we have to answer them all the time, because there's a number of ways to answer them. But, it's just, it can get tiring, of course. And so, but what we want to say is to people who are like, oh, well, what about this? And what about that? Are there limits? Because this is sort of it's tied to the all-encompassing worldview question. It's tied to the libertinism question, because people have a sense of desire for there to be some sort of boundaries and order within which in the world that they live in, right? So like the authority question is kind of wrapped up into that. People want to know, well, does that mean there's no authority? Well, no, that authority gets created through agreements. And that we live, and those create the authority that we kind of agree to, like in a sense. It's not quite this way as it would be with like a boss, but like Norman has authority over me because he's the president and I report to him in our organization. But that was something we agreed into. I mean, there's no browbeating, except on a Saturday night when we're arguing over things. No, I'm kidding. There's those agreements there. So people want to ask this. Yeah, the KPIs. All right.
Sorry. That's a bad joke.
Yeah. So the question is, people want to know what the limits are. And I think it's part of the libertarian, the onus is on us to sort of help them visualize what kind of world are we asking people to want to live in. And it does not mean chaos and the anarchy that is related to the word chaos, not the anarchy that we all are probably sitting in here in this room.
Guys.
Yeah. Yeah. So they just want to know that, like, in a way, like, can I live in a world where I feel like I'm safe and can navigate a world where I'm not in danger or in threat? And we're like, well, of course, don't tread on anyone is our mantra, right?
Have y'all thought, or do you agree that there's similarities between the universalist instincts of Protestantism and progressivism?
Ooh, you're getting deep there, buddy. All right. Well,
I don't even say. Repeat that question again. I'm like that. Wow.
I've just been listening to and reading on some interesting discussion about there's a very linear correlation between the history of progressivism and Protestantism. And there's very universalist instincts in both of them.
Ah, okay.
So the short answer, I think, is there is some connectivity there, but it tends to follow trends that are not purely linked with Protestantism. I can sometimes not say that word.
Same here. Well. Thank you. I'm so glad to find another person. Yeah. It drives me crazy.
See you Austinites.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. It's Austinites. Yeah.
Yes.
That's it. But so part of the reason I would say that is that it doesn't appear, why it's not consistent across the board, is that we do see this as a trend as well in parts of Catholicism too, and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. These are not exclusively related to Protestantism. Okay. So I think it's more important at that point to kind of look at certain bits and trends that kind of make their way into the theology and see how it kind of works its way out. Because it's just not intuitively obvious, I think, at all that just being non-Catholic will result in this kind of leftist bent. There's a lot more that comes from, say, the philosophies that have, like from the German historical school and how that made its way into America over time. And then ideas from, from those those communist ideas that ended up kind of trickling in and now have kind of percolated through a lot of the university systems and whatnot, which is really, really disturbing, of course. And that ended up making its way into theology in certain ways, that especially the German historical school and higher criticism that resulted from that. And there have been some positives, I think, that we can kind of accept and realize that, real important developments and in ways of thinking, even for theology, but on the whole, not so great. And so it's a bit of a roundabout way of answering the question, but it's like you're asking a really big one there. But I think the short, not exactly correlated. The long is that when you start looking at the actual, like the trends that kind of build up in that, I think those are coincidental.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned something earlier. It might have been you, Doug, about there's one true high power, one true, person, entity to worship, and it's not Caesar. It's Caesar's crossed out on your hat.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to ask you, this is something I don't believe I've asked anyone yet, but I thought, why not? These guys might have a good answer for this. The churches who obeyed the government during 2020 and closed their doors. Is that a sin?
Doug, are you going to take that?
Yeah, I gotta think about my answer, and maybe that's telling. I don't know. I'm gonna say it depends. That's such an easy answer. I know.
Equivocation again. No.
No, and I think here's the thing. When people want to know what should the church's response be to the government saying they should shut down, I'm of two minds here. One is for the church leader. Well, I should say it this way. The thing that should be present in every church leadership is prayerful activity as to what should we do? What is the Holy Spirit saying? What is God wanting them to do? And I think there are times where saying to the government, no, we're going to do our thing is going to be the right answer. And I think sometimes the answer could be something different. And I think every individual church did come to different answers and to different conclusions. And it might be because of their particular circumstances. If you're a rural church in Idaho in April of 2020, and you're relatively able to do things that allow you to keep worshiping together in one building, it's going to be a very different answer than if you're a mega church in Houston or wherever, where you're going to be in tight quarters. Now, I'm obviously not answering the question of what was the genuine threat and all of that. But I mean, the answer for me on that is that each church has to decide. I think it's probably a sin if all they did was say, well, government's telling us we shut down. You know what? We're just going to shut down. I would say that the sin is not obeying the government per se, but not taking it upon yourself to actually ask yourself, well, what's really going on here? What is God asking us to do? And
what's could best mean for that our congregation.
Yeah, what's best for our congregation and the health of the people. I mean, for crying out loud, if again, this is all circumstantial, and what I want to say is well, if you're simply just following the government because they said that, and that's all the information you have, and that's all you do, then yeah, it's a big problem for me. I'm not going to be the person to say you're a sinner and here's how you're sinning in particular. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the direction that I would go. I'm also very forgiving when it comes to I don't know, the first 2 to 3 weeks of this whole thing, and people being well, okay, let's just not meet for 2 weeks. But my goodness, after that, we know more information. By July, we knew we didn't have to wipe everything down before we had people come in the building because that's not how it spreads, or because this or that, sort of thing. So I know a lot of churches that navigated this in a sort of up and down manner where they implemented social distancing but not masks, or masks only while you're close, and whatever. There's a handful of ways that you can navigate that, but the just follow the government is just because that's what Saint Fauci said, then is not the way to go.
Saint Fauci.
Oh, Norman, you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to Doug's right there. Is that it's rather rather than just kind of a binary, did they close or open per se? I think there's a range of different responses that were entirely valid. I think it's, if a church, for instance, would be concerned because the government did say, if you meet, we're going to arrest you and throw you all in prison. I think that your church would be, maybe it's kind of an interesting question to be had, and maybe debated amongst your compatriots, and be okay, we're going to decide how we want to respond to this, because we don't want Joe Ellen and Bill over here to get thrown in prison just because they wanted to go to church. I mean, there are a lot of practical concerns here that prudentially you might have to work through as a congregation. But just doing, just put up and shut up because the government said so, that would be a bit of that's a bit of a hard row to hoe there. But I think, a lot of churches really did, take it upon themselves to consider carefully what they could do to remain open and offer services, offer opportunities to worship in a host of ways that help people to work through the problem a little better than otherwise.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was really tough for my family, for instance, because we have our own challenges with our children, and being involved in services was really, really difficult. Especially as things were kind of ratcheted up on the case front and all that, and just because of everything that was going on in the communities and everything.
Yeah.
Now it's a little easier. We figured out alternative ways of working and on this all out. So now we're a bit more stable in that regard. We still have our own difficulties and whatnot, COVID and not COVID related in that respect to church. But at least now we're better off than we were.
Yeah. Can I add one more thing? I think one image that a lot of non-Christians have of Christians is that there's, they have their lifestyle in a way and they have their beliefs, but that what defines them is that they go to church and congregate on Sundays. And that's fine. I mean, that's a perfectly fine image, but it's not all that Christians do. And one of the ways that Jesus says that people will know you is that you'll love one another and that you also serve the poor and that you also take care of those who are on the margins. And I don't know if the church had the reputation during COVID of looking for ways to help those who are in need. I mean, I know it happened because I know of, individually, but the reputation, of course, the media is going to, the corporate press is going to paint that in the way that it's going to look as bad as possible. But, I would want Christians to have that reputation of going out and finding ways to help those who are on the margins rather than being known as just only disobeying the government or only, doing these other things that somewhat seem to be self-serving. No, we just want to go to church on Sunday because, the government says we can't. I don't care what the government says. I mean, that's fine. You can still go to church, meet, all of that. But when that's what you're known for is only your own need to go to church on Sunday, that's very different from the reputation of going out and serving those who are actually in need. And I think that's where some people got a little turned off by some Christians, is because it looked self-serving. Now, again, like I said, the media is going to paint it in that light. Sure, and I'm not saying that those individuals were self-serving. I'm just saying that it could look that way.
Well, all right. Dang, this has gone by so quick. I look over and it's been much more time than I thought. So I think
we're still here.
I know, right? Faith-seeking freedom is.
I could do this all night, to quote a famous hero.
Very nice. Let's talk about this book really quick. I think I was told that there's a promo code that the listeners of this show can use. Talk about that, Doug.
Yeah. So, Buck, I've been listening to your podcast for a little while, and I even listened to it before it was rebranded. So, I'm happy to offer to my fellow listener, whatever, the listeners, people who love your podcast, people who listen like me, on the audiobook on libertarianchristians.com. If you use Counterflow as the coupon code at checkout for just the audiobook, Faith Seeking Freedom, you'll get it half off. If you are an Audible subscriber, you can, of course, use a credit to purchase the book. But if you download it straight from us, actually, it supports our institute a little bit more, and also it's, I think, a better price by a bit. So, Counterflow at checkout.
And also, if you want a physical copy, we are running a pretty consistently right now a 2 for $20, where if you just contribute $20 to the organization, the Libertarian Christian Institute, via our website, that we can send you a couple copies of the book at all gratis at that point. So if we would really hope that if you're our fellow Christians out there, or listeners to the show, if you haven't heard of us before, come check us out at libertarianchristians.com, and we'd love to interact with you and try to support you with knowledge and understanding and wisdom as best as we know how. We love to talk to our people and our fellow brothers and sisters. We're thankful for everybody who interacts with us. And if you're willing to come and support us and be alongside us in helping us, then we would honor that and continue to do what we do as best we can.
Excellent. And how often does that podcast drop? Not to mention it's on YouTube as well. How often does your podcast drop?
We go every week.
Once a week, just like this one.
Yep.
Perfect. All right.
We have once a week. We also have a second podcast called Good News, Bad News, the Roundtable. That's every other week. We get together, do it on YouTube. But yeah.
Excellent. All right. Norman, Horn, Doug Stewart, the Libertarian Christian Institute representatives on the show here. Thank you guys so much for being here on Counterflow.
Thanks, Buck. It's been awesome.
Thanks, Buck.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you liked today's episode, we encourage you to rate us on Apple Podcasts to help expand our audience. If you want to reach out to us, email us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can also reach us at LCI Official on Twitter. And of course, we are on Facebook and have an active group you are welcome to join. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to find out more about LCI, visit us on the web at libertarianchristians.com. The voiceovers are by Matt Bellis and Catherine Williams. As of episode 115, our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.